School counselors, what is the most embarrassing reason a kid has ended up in your office? A guy in one of my HS Chem classes tried sneaking some sodium, if I remember right, out of the classroom. He unfortunately decided he would hide it in a paper towel in his crotch. He eventually sweated enough to activate it and ended up burning his crotch pretty badly. School had to call an ambulance. Story 2. I have one involving both counselors and nurses. I have very well documented allergies to things like peanuts and pet dander and dust mites and fabric softener and anything that flowers. So basically, I am always having some kind of allergic reaction. My school had a zero tolerance policy, so I had to go to the nurse and ask politely for my allergy medication. On the relatively frequent occasions, I would break out in painful hives. After realizing I was doing this, the school counselor started intercepting me to interrogate me about why I was trying to get out of class, what was really bothering me, and if I had found some clever new way to get high. The phrase, "No, really? Look at these nasty hives all over my arms," meant nothing to her. She eventually called my allergist to ask him, hypothetically, if it was possible for me to have reactions this frequently, then called my parents and suggested they consider taking me to a psychologist, because it might be psychosomatic. It wasn't my immune system is just Schmidt. Story 3. I put my hand through a window in high school, trying to kill a bug on the window. When I got to the nurse, she was like, "Sweet, nothing like this ever happens." Story 4. I'll throw myself in here, not a nurse, but the embarrassing kid. I grew up with a dairy allergy, not lactose intolerance, like an actual allergy, where I was told that my throat would close and eyes swell up, or it did a couple times when I was much younger. Was pretty vigilant about not eating dairy, so I don't have an actual memory of a reaction. Well, second day of my freshman year, I bought a sub and checked it for cheese. Ate half of it before I realized there was white Swiss on it. I freaked out and went to the office and told them. They called an ambulance, and my parents rushed there. And it turns out I've definitely grown out of the allergy. 10 years later, and my friends still harass me about the time I got scared by a sandwich and called an ambulance. Still embarrassed about it every time. Edit. Man, Reddit knows how to take the edge off of an ancient, embarrassing moment. Next time my friends make fun of me, I'll laugh knowing, whatever. I didn't die, and it got me Reddit gold. Thank you. Story 5. When I was in grade 9, we were reenacting battles from wars with marshmallow ammunition in the schoolyard, and somebody whipped a marshmallow right into my open eye. This sounds like the wimpiest injury ever, and it really was, but it hurt, and I couldn't open my eye or see. I had to go to the nurse and explain that the black eye I was getting was from a marshmallow, and she had to do like an eye rinse to get out all the powdery sugar. She even called my mom, and they just laughed at me. Story 6. We dissected a pig in biology in high school, and a guy stuck his scalpel up its throat and was walking around the classroom quoting lines from Lord of the Flies. Needless to say, he got suspended for it. Story 7. A boy in my 7th grade class snorted a line of sugar he poured from a pixie stick. He promptly got a severe nosebleed that would not stop, and he had to go to the nurse's office, and he was there until his mom could pick him up and take him home. Story 8. You know how your teachers would always yell at you when you tilted your chair back? Because they once had a kid bust their head open after falling. Yeah, I'm that kid. Story 9. I got sent to the nurse once for getting quarters stuck up my nose. Some kid bet me that I couldn't fit 3 quarters up my nose. He was wrong. Never considered how I'd get them out. Story 10. Not a nurse. One day I decided that my bully had enough fun with me. So I dumped crazy glue into his hands and told him, "It will make your hair gleam." Once he put his hands into his hair, insta-stick. He spent 3-4 hours with the nurse cutting his hair. He didn't come back to school for 3 weeks. Story 11. I worked at a summer camp, and apparently they had to stop selling rabbit pelts in the gift shop because boys would buy them, masturbate with them, not clean them up so the cum would get the fur all stiff and pointy. Try and use it again the next night and scratch up their penises and have to go to the nurse. Edit. I don't know why boys would use the pelts to masturbate with, other than that the fur was really soft. I was never a 12-year-old boy with a penis. Story 12. I had a friend who cut himself pretty deep with scissors. He proceeded to try to see how many pieces of 7 lead he could stick into his body. He got about halfway through one piece when it broke inside him, and he had excruciating pain which he described as a burning and stinging. We were only in middle school, and he went to the school nurse who tried to squeeze it out of him, and then just assumed it had entered the bloodstream and left him alone. Story 13. I got sent to the counselor because somehow she heard I had sex with a semi-popular grade 12 guy. I was in grade 11, and she wanted to know if it was a rumor or not. Get out of my business. Harsh. Edit to add that I was so embarrassed, I left school for the rest of the day. Story 14. My mom is a school nurse. One day after the school day ended, she was about to leave when someone came to get her about an emergency. A student needed something from his locker in a sports locker room. The door was locked. He decided he would crawl into the ceiling, over the door, over the locker room, drop down from the ceiling, get what he needed, and crawl back out through the ceiling. The kid fell through the ceiling before he could make it inside the locker room. Story 15. My son's middle school had a really skittish nurse. I'm not sure what her qualifications were, but she called for an ambulance about twice a week. My son is asthmatic and had a complicated regimen back then. This woman just couldn't handle it for some reason, so we had to have my son take his meds right before and right after school, and he had to smuggle in his inhaler. But he never got flack for that until the end of his second year there. One day he hit his head in shop class. Not bad, but they sent him to the nurse. She calls me at work and says I had to pick him up. I told her to call my wife, who worked from home and was 5 minutes away. She couldn't process that and said no, I had to pick him up. I said that was silly. I was at least an hour away, and why my wife was primary contact. She said she didn't answer the phone. I sent an IM to my wife, and she said she hadn't gotten a call. So she called the school. The nurse insists that if I am anything of a responsible father, I was to be there in 10 minutes or she's sending my son to the hospital. WTF? I am an hour away. My wife can be there in 5 minutes. So my wife gets through and the nurse speaks to her. I forgot what led to this, but my wife ends up in a fight with the nurse who refuses to tell her about why her son was being sent to a hospital. So my wife says she'll be there in 5 minutes to sort it all out. The nurse considers this a threat to her life and calls the cops. So my wife is met at the school nurse office by the police and EMTs. Because the nurse called an ambulance during this, an EMT calls me because the nurse is dealing with my wife and the cops. He says my son is fine, just a little freaked out because some woman claiming to be my ex-wife or something is being accused of threatening bodily harm to the nurse. In the end, no one was arrested and my wife sent my son back to class. My wife said the nurse was so crazy. The cops pretty much took my wife's side right away. But she was no longer allowed on school grounds because the vice principal was also crazy and scared of my wife. The next time my son was in the nurse's office, he was caught with his prescribed inhaler. I had to come pick it up right away because it was a unauthorized potential explosive contaminant. I got the call walking my dog, and the school was 5 minutes away. So I just went right over. Oh man. The second that nurse saw my Pekin G's, she flipped the f*** out. Said it was a dirty dog, and some kid allergic to dogs could die. And wow, she wouldn't even get near me and had an office aide hand me the inhaler. That woman was crazy. Story 16. Not entirely the same thing, but in my freshman Gen Chem lab, someone managed to stick a glass funnel all the way through their hand. He had been trying to fit a hose around it and accidentally stabbed himself with it. It didn't help that his was somewhat chipped at the end, making it sharper. They ended up having to call an ambulance. It was rather gory. Lab was canceled, though. I guess one man's misery is another man's fortune. Story 17. Not a counselor, but one time a group of boys streaked at a homecoming game. At the time, our football field had a Schmitty wire fence around it. So when they made it across the field to the fence, 2 of them made it over. The third left part of his ball sack stuck to the fence. Story 18. When I was in first grade, my parents bought me some ridiculous costume jewelry, and I decided to wear a flimsy metal ring, comparable to what you'd get from a gumball machine, to school one day. For some dumb reason, I decided to stick my entire finger in my mouth and bite down on the ring while it was on my finger. It would bend from my biting it, and I thought it was cool and interesting. When I finally realized that this might have been a foolish thing to do, I had bit down on the ring so much that I couldn't get the ring off. We had a substitute that day that seemed really mean, so I was afraid to say anything to her. So I kept biting down on it, hoping that I could somehow bend it back to its original state and I'd be able to get it off. Wrong. I ended up biting down on it so much that it crimped down on my finger. I still didn't want to say anything to the teacher for worry of getting in trouble, so I just kept messing with it, making it worse. After about 15 minutes and developing a cold, purple, dying finger, I finally freaked the hell out and burst into tears. The teacher was surprisingly nice about my little problem and sent me to the nurse. The school nurse dunked my hand in ice water and then would try to yank it off. It didn't work, but I think the ice water bath kept me from losing my finger forever. And after a half hour, she called my mother. My mom was not one who's great in a crisis and freaked out as much as 6-year-old me did. She called my dad while he was at work. She drove me there, and he cut the ring off with some bolt cutters or nipping pliers in about 3 seconds. I cried because I felt so dumb, and he felt bad that I felt bad. So he bought me an ice cream cone from Thrifty's and got to skip out on school for the rest of the day. Tal dar. Almost docked my own finger off like a puppy dog's tail while in school. Dad saved the day, and I got cookies and cream and the day off as a reward for being an idiot. Story 19. We were dissecting rats in 9th grade and bet a kid that he wouldn't eat the rat's balls. For $30, he did. He had to be taken to the hospital to get his stomach pumped because the rat's balls were covered in formaldehyde. Story 20. Middle school counselor here. Not really WTF, but a 7th grader came to see me in tears because she thought she might be pregnant. After some discussion, I realized that she had given a hand job and thought she could get pregnant from getting semen on her hands. Edit. Apparently this is WTF, and my standard for WTF is a bit too high. I feel uncomfortable sharing my more crazy stories, and many of them are just real depressing. Story 21. In my freshman biology in high school, there were two kids who were throwing sharp dissecting objects at the ceiling, while the teacher was of the classroom to get them lodged in the ceiling, like people do with pencils sometimes, during our frog dissections, and one of the kids accidentally stabbed the other one with a scalpel in his shoulder. The kid who got stabbed got pissed and punched the other kid, and the both ended up going to the nurse. I thought it was pretty WTF. Story 22. Our art room was directly above the shop room, both on an exterior corner of the school. For some reason, the shop exhaust tube was turned upside down one day, making it vent directly into the art room's intake. The counselors were perplexed when they had a room full of sick and loopy students. They accused us of all getting high, and we were all sent back to the art room, until even the teacher presented with the same symptoms. I think all we did was sit outside for a bit, then we all continued on with our day in other classrooms. Story 23. I once got sent to the principal in 5th grade because I went to the nurse after hurting my knee in gym, but the teachers thought that I was there to cheer on a friend who had gotten into a fight that I didn't even know happened. Turns out, my principal thought that she knew everything about every individual kid because she took a class about child development. The same principal also accused me of insubordination because I was wearing the same coat as the offender, found out it wasn't me, and still gave me a detention. Tell. Doctor. My principal was a power-tripping pussy who got me a ridiculous number of detentions and counselor trips for an elementary school student. Edit. This was a recurring thing throughout grade school between us. Story 24. I once got one of those, stuck in my ear in high school. I tried fishing it out with my fingers, a pencil, etc., but it was lodged pretty tight, so finally I said, "Damn it," and went to the nurse. Since she knew that I was going to music school for college pursuing music, she didn't want to touch it because if something went wrong, she didn't want to be responsible for damaging my hearing. So, she gave me the name of an ent doctor and called my mother to come pick me up. The ent doctor went in with tweezers and plucked it right out. Kind of a waste of time, but I got to miss most of a day of classes for it, so it was all good. Story 25. When I was in 2nd grade, a boy held a pencil point up on my chair, and I sat on it. It traveled through my jeans and underwear without any damage and stuck firmly in my little butt cheek. On this day, we happened to have a substitute teacher, and when I started crying, she took me into the in-classroom restroom and looked at my butt, informed me that the tip of the pencil was stuck in there, and I took off running and crying down the hall. I turned a corner and the janitor, Ralph, called out, "Do you have a pass?" To which I replied, "There's a pencil stuck in my butt." Then I continued down the hall to the nurse's office. The school nurse, Sherry, was a very sweet lady. She calmed me down, called my mom to ask for permission to touch my butt, and plucked it out. I got to go home for the day. I consider it a win. Dar nurse plucked some wood out my tush. Edit. Thank you so much for the gold. I really appreciate it. Story 26. In 2nd grade, I went to the nurse's office with a good-sized hole in my ear. I fell while running to the bathroom and slammed my head into the corner of a filing cabinet. The nurse had no idea what to do, so she put dry gauze on the hole. Later, it became very apparent that that was a bad idea. Story 27. I was one of those kids who couldn't look the nurse in the eye after an accident in the cafeteria. I'm sorry, Mrs. C. So, one overcast morning in elementary school, I was sitting at one of those long lunch tables, and some kid decided that he wanted my Lunchable. I had just started to open it. This is way back before they all had the cardboard pull tabs, 1997-ish. And I was really excited to have this because I usually only ever really were school lunches. So the kid stands behind me and tries to rip it out of my hands, and naturally, and having anticipated this lunch all morning, I fought back. I pulled it down and closer to my chest to hide it, and he pulled up again and manages to get the open corner under my glasses and into my eye, and I let go. My eye was stinging. Once I looked up at him, he immediately handed it back to me and said I needed to go see the nurse. I told him no because I didn't trust him and that I wanted to eat my Lunchable, so I stayed seated. A few minutes later, my eye felt much worse, and one of the cafeteria aides noticed my eye. It must have looked bad, pulled me aside and sent me to the nurse. After checking my eye out, the nurse called my mom to take me to the eye doctor. My eye was all sorts of red and messed up looking. So we get into an optometrist super fast, and they dyed my eye with some crazy things I don't really remember, and it turned out I had a pretty bad corneal tear from that wicked sharp corner on the box. I had to wear an eye patch for what seemed like forever on my dominant better eye because of the scratch. So it kind of sucked for a while, Fast forward around to 2008 or so. My brother brings us to his girlfriend's house for dinner to meet the rest of her family. We get there and find out her mom is the nurse from my elementary school and remembered me quite well. If I recall correctly, she said I was one of the worst, scariest cases she ever had walk through her door while she was there. I was and am still extremely embarrassed about this, but I can laugh about it now. Haha. It's more or less the running joke in the family. It could be worse, right? And if you stuck with it and read that wall of text, thank you. I appreciate it and apologize for the poor mobile device formatting. TLDR. Cut my cornea open with a sharp Lunchables box corner fighting with some kid. Go to nurse, go to eye doctor. 10-ish years later. Discovered my little brother dated her daughter and her mom remembered me. Cue awkward family dinner. Story 28. One winter in junior high, my classmates engaged in running across a frozen pond for kicks and giggles. One of them decided he would run across barefoot, and suckily for him, the ice decided to break under his bare soles. Needless to say, there were cuts and blood all over, and since our school's nurse was on lunch break, our maths teacher had to carry him to a nearby school where they could tend to him. Story 29. I got sent to the principal's one time because my friend apparently tried calling Pizza Hut, but instead called the superintendent by accident and asked for the family deal. When the man on the other end of the line asked who it was, he replied with my name, Edit, because everyone keeps complaining it didn't happen, which it would seem like because I didn't explain it very well. To clarify, he called the number for Pizza Hut. The guy on the other end hung up because my friend was laughing and couldn't execute the prank. Then, dumbass decided to hit 69, thinking that it would call the last person that the phone called, which is wrong because it calls the last person that called, which happened to be the superintendent. Story 30. In my high school Gen Chem lab, we had about 10 students, one of which got his finger stuck in a wooden test tube rack. He hid that hand behind his back for a good amount of time before our lab teacher noticed and asked why he was doing so. He ended up having to have the jewelry teacher in the classroom next door saw it off. Story 31. In grade 2 during recess, we were playing cops and robbers, and there was a ramp with bumpy things. Back in the day, playgrounds were made with solid wood. It was legit like a row of logs that formed a ramp that were particularly slippery during the winter season. This was in Canada and it had just snowed. So I was running away from a cop. I tried to slide down on my bum for ultra-fast speed, get away down the ramp. At the same time, a fellow robber had the same idea. Unfortunately, he was bigger, so he veered me off course, and I slammed Punani first onto the handrail near the end of the ramp. I sat there for at least 5 minutes, holding back tears of pain, when I realized my snow pants, everyone wears it when you're a kid lol, were feeling wet. I assumed the snow must have got in or I was sweating. I tried to get up, but couldn't. Too much pain. A cop tagged me, and since I didn't move towards the jail, he tried dragging me. My screams of pain began, got the attention of an older kid who was supervising that day for recess, and he called a teacher. I was carried into the school. The teacher helped me take off my snow pants, only to discover not only was my 6-wire-old, 7-wire-old vag bleeding, but I had also peed myself. Mom came to pick me up, took me to the docks. Everything was fine. Next day at school, I had to sit out during recess because I didn't have snow pants. Those were some sad times. Oh, and I was also given the nickname Pea Bleeds. Grade 2 was a bad year. Story 32. You know those round metal things with bars so that kids can climb all over them? I slipped on one and landed with a bar hitting my balls. I had to go to the nurse and hold an ice pack on my balls until my mom picked me up from school. Story 33. I was always a fan of hot food and somehow came into possession of, at the time, the hottest sauce I've ever seen. Literally, the first time I opened the thing to smell the sweet, sweet liquid napalm, I was blinded. Damn fumes left my eyes a drippy mess for a good 15 minutes. So naturally, I start hauling the thing around in my pocket, spreading the torment to my classmates. Then one day, the rumor of the sudden death sauce creeping around campus and stupid kids seeking out the damn thing. I'm in my keyboarding class, passing it around, when one kid snatches the bottle from my hand with one of those entitled rich kid smirks. Dude, if you wanted to sniff the damn thing, you could have asked. I say to the twerp, nah, I'm gonna chug it, he declared, his eyes scanning his new audience. As silence blankets the room, those few who've simply smelled it know what kind of hell this idiot is about to unleash. That's really not a, you know what? Go for it. My ire has overpowered the goodwill in me, and I can't wait to see this dumbass in agony. He unscrews the cap, sneers at me, his victory seemingly complete, and threatens, "It's cool, I'm Mexican," and downs half the goddamn bottle. And what followed next can only be described as a rabid mongoose trying to tear itself from his stomach. We drag him off to the nurse and carry on. I don't see him in class for about a month. Turns out it ate through his stomach lining and gave him an ulcer the size of my fist, and he had to get his stomach pumped, stitched, whatever, in the emergency room. Best day of that whole semester. TLDR, stupid asshole. Chugs pure napalm, gets sent to emergency room. Story 34. I was a school nurse. The saddest ones are the ones that have to be sent to my office, then home, repeatedly for head lice. The parents often don't give a schmidt. Sometimes the only solution is to have the kids shave their heads. Those kids are so embarrassed. Story 35. Well, when I was in year 9, a student tried to kill himself in and during a lesson. This was a serious attempt by strangling himself with his own hands in front of the teachers and all of us, leaving us wondering WTF he was doing. Story 36. When I was in the principal's office in elementary school, some first grader was brought in because he had peed all over the walls of the bathroom, like the whole thing. Story 37. One time in 6th grade, I was playing with scissors in my art class and cut my bottom lip. I put my hand to my lip instantly out of fear, and it was covered with blood. I walked up to the teacher, who was in the process of scolding some kid for doing something stupid with the art supplies. And when he turned to me, he was so frustrated, he said, "You better be bleeding." I showed him my lip. He just shook his head and said, "Go to the nurse." I still have a little U-shaped scar on the bottom of my bottom lip from that incident. Story 38. Well, I feel like this fits here somewhat, so I will throw it in. I took a lot of art classes in high school, but so did a lot of assholes who just wanted an easy A. One such asshole sat across from me, was well known for being a troublemaker, and decided one day it would be cool to throw an X-Acto knife at me. It stuck in my leg. There was only one nurse for 3 schools in the district. Needless to say, I dealt with it myself. Story 39. In high school, there was a kid who took a schmidt in the middle of the hallway, like totally just dropped his drawers and went at it. It took place while everyone was in class, so it took a while for everyone to find out who did it. But once they did, suffice to say, we didn't see that kid for another week or 2. Edit. There was also another kid who got a hold of potassium from our chem room and mixed it with water. For those that don't know what happens when potassium is mixed with water, basically, the water gets super hot from a chemical reaction between the two. Anyway, mixing the two to see the reaction is a fairly common experiment, but you're only supposed to put about a pea-sized piece of potassium in a beaker of water. But this kid drops a handful in and there's a huge explosion. There were beaker shards everywhere and it sounded like a bomb went off, and the water got so hot that it completely evaporated. So, right where the reaction took place, there was no evidence there, except for the glass shards in the ceiling right above it. Somehow, no one got hurt and/or died, but the perpetrator was suspended for about a month. Story 40. I don't fully remember the context, but one of the kids in my 10th grade science class was pretending like he was going to sit on a glass test tube. He kept holding it under him and crouching down like he was going to sit on it and then wouldn't. It was part of some joke he was telling with his friends while we waiting for homeroom to get started. Our homeroom was held in the science lab. Well, eventually he slipped, landed on the test tube with his ass cheek, broke the test tube, got glass in his ass. And since we had no school nurse, the principal had to confirm the injury and call his parents in an ambulance so he could go get stitches. He got to stand in class for like a week after that and got a couple days off. Story 41. I was sent to detention, which inevitably also meant seeing the counselor for misbehaving in grade 7. My crime? I didn't stand up when I was told to. I was in a wheelchair. The counselor thought I was lying when I got to his office when I told him what happened, so kept me on detention. I got home, told my mom. She lawyered up and had him write a letter that scared the schmidt out of the principal. So much I never saw that teacher or the counselor ever again. Story 42. I got sent to the school counselor for playing ankles with my buddy. For those of you that don't know, the game of ankles consists of 2 simple rules. 1, pull your pants down to your ankles. 2, whoever pulls their pants up first loses. I have never seen a more confused look on my principal's face than when he caught us, and to top it all off, I lost. Story 43. Back in grade 8, there was a tree that had grown too big to be safe around the school. It would crush the school if it fell that way. So they, some tree cutter crew, had to cut it down, and there was a ton of wood chips lying around the tree stump, and they were using a leaf blower to get them in one area so they could dispose of them easily. But one small wood chip caught the wind and flew right into my eye at lunch recess. I left it alone, thinking my eye would naturally get rid of it. It didn't, and by the end of the school day, the principal tried to flush it out, but to no avail. I ended up having to go to the ER and have a doctor swab it out of my eye. It had gotten lodged into the top of my eye and was scraping my eyelid the whole day. That hurt like a and made me need glasses. Taldar. Small wood chip got lodged in my eye in 8th grade. Tried to flush it out, didn't work. Went to air, they swabbed it out. Story 44. We had about 5 kids, 5th graders, come in one day after lunch because one of the other kids brought a habanero pepper and convinced them all to try it. You'd think they would learn after the first one did it. Nope. Story 45. In my senior year of high school, I sliced one of my fingers, left ring on the soft underside, almost in half lengthwise, with an X-Acto blade moments after my art teacher warned us to be careful because 2 freshmen accidentally stabbed each other in the butt first period. I sat there for an hour trying to secretly stem the bleeding with the paper towel help of the friends in my desk group. When I finally admitted what I'd done, the school nurse said she couldn't help me and was about to call 911 for an ambulance, which I thought would be a spectacular waste of a couple $1,000s. So I drove myself. But because I didn't take an ambulance, I wasn't admitted right away and sat there bleeding for another 3 hours. Lost a lot of blood and got 11 stitches, still have a scar. Story 46. I have a 6th grader that poops his pants and then, in the classroom, shakes the poop balls out of his pants leg onto the floor. He also tries to flush his dirty underwear and on numerous occasions has shoved them into the toilet paper dispenser. The poor janitor couldn't figure out why it wasn't working one day and put her hand up there to unjam it, only to have her hand covered in diarrhea. I have a student that complained to parents and teachers about pain in his ear for over a week. Came to my office and I discovered a dead roach in his ear. I called the parent, who was unconcerned, and said, "Yeah, we got roaches." I have 2 4th grade girls whose mother tattooed party dots and stars on them with a pen and needle. Same girls have missed over 30 days of school for head lice. DHS has yet to remove them from the home. Story 47. I was in 8th grade. I thought it was fine. T leaned my chair back on the wall because it was the wall, not just the air. Well, my teacher looked at me and said, "You know what they say about kids who lean in their chairs." FYI, this teacher was also notorious about being a bit of a cynical penis. He even invented a game called Bloody Ulcer to stop us from interrupting other students when they were reading. It was a language arts class. Anyways, he finishes that line, I slip back and knock myself out for a good 5 seconds before my head rebooted, and I find myself 90 degrees rotated and my head hurt quite a bit. The teacher was doubled over his desk, dying of laughter, and the rest of the class joining in. I gave myself a very minor concussion according to the nurse. I never lived that day down. Story 48. Not a nurse or counselor, but back in the day, my high school was huge rivals with another school, and it was devolved into vandalism before games, after games. So my uncle's friend decided to step it up a notch and sneak into the opposing team's pep rally and streak ass naked across the gym with our high school letters painted on him. Now keep in mind, this was towards the end of the football season, and there was a good 2 to 3 inches of snow on the ground. He does his thing and then bursts out of the emergency exit to escape the security. He makes all the across the school grounds to the orange snow fence with metal poles. He tried to hop it, foot got caught in a snowdrift, ball sack caught on the metal pole, ripped it. They didn't even punish him for streaking. He had enough. Teal, dar, streaking through snow. Ball sack got caught on a snow fence's metal support. Story 49. Not a nurse, but here's a pretty embarrassing story. In the 8th grade, I managed to get a hold of some zip ties. In the middle of math class, I put one around both wrists and tightened it to pretend I had handcuffs. After pretending, I realized I couldn't get them off. For some reason, I kept tightening it for a while with my hands under my desk, pretending I was paying attention to the teacher. After a while, I realized I couldn't feel my hands anymore. I looked down. Both hands are dark purple. I find scissors in my backpack, but I was unable to grab them due to no feeling in my hands. After freaking out a bit, I calmly raise both hands in the air. Teacher stops mid-sentence, runs to his desk, grabs scissors, runs to me, and cuts off the zip tie. Everyone in class starts laughing. I leave humiliated. Story 50. I was a senior in high school in my biology class. We were mating fruit flies, and we used CO2 to knock them out and characterize the offspring. To generate the CO2, we used Alka-Seltzer tablets. One day 4 of us decided to see what would happen if we ate one. We each grabbed one, and just after putting it in our mouth, our teacher calls the class up to the front for a quiz. We each swallow quickly as we didn't want to get caught messing around with the lab supplies. I think our teacher knew what we were doing, but just wanted to watch us suffer. That stomach ache only compared to when I got salmonella. Tal. Doctor ate Alka-Seltzer tablets. Teacher didn't say anything and watched us suffer. Story 51. Not a nurse. My junior year of high school, I took physics. We were doing some experiment that involved boiling down chemicals of some sort in flasks, and then heating the remains on a Bunsen burner to dry them out, and then measure something about the remains. I was talking to my partner about Sports Center or something when I poured really cold water into a hot flask, and it exploded like a glass frag grenade. Nobody got hurt, but for the rest of the year, and this took place in like August, my teacher made me wear gloves, goggles, and an apron whenever we did any lab, even if it didn't involve chemicals or anything of the sort, and made me yell, "Fire in the hole," whenever I did any significant step. Needless to say, my class always looked forward to labs. Story 52. I was a program coordinator / counselor at a summer day camp a few years back. Worst story. One day, a camp student decided it was a grand idea to put scissors up his nose. 2 blades, 2 nostrils. Makes sense when you're 8. Of course, his instructor caught him and told him to remove them. Friend next to him decided to help his buddy. Take them out and snip. Clamped the scissors closed. Cleanly bisected his septum. Blood gushed, and both kids freaked out. understandably. He got half-assedly patched up by a staff member, while I had the pleasure of calling his mom, who let out a long, annoyed sigh and said plainly, "Really? He did it again?" He'd done this a few times at home before, apparently, with the same outcome pretty much every time. Told us to keep those scissors out of your nose, kids. Story 53. Not in an authority position, but I was once one of these kids. Growing up as a Canadian in the States and the son of an artist, we had a lot of nude art in our house, all very tasteful. So I came to regard the nude as the natural mode for a portrait. And when I started doodling, poorly, age 8 or 9, I invited the daughters of 2 of the best-known lawyers in our town to pose for me in the coat room. And well, I ended up in the principal's office. He called my parents in the next day and handed them the drawings and demanded they offer an explanation and a suggestion for an appropriate punishment. My dad took one look at the sketches and proclaimed them pretty good. Story 54 was a student doing extra credit for chemistry and actually got pretty good at making stuff. I could bend, draw, size glass tubing with a Bunsen burner, did a number of experiments for extra credit, screwed up the ammonia vacuum experiment way too many times, figured out how to make colored sterno, and scared the hell out of my classmates when I sent the countertop up in rainbow-colored flames. One of my classmates wasn't nearly as talented with the glass. In attempting to make a bend, he let it get too cold. It was still hot enough that it was sterile and mostly cauterized on its way through very, very little blood, but it wasn't molten enough to bend. It snapped and went straight through his hand, right in the meat of the palm. Story 55. Well, this is something my old chemistry teacher from high school told me. A few years ago at my high school, there were a bunch of kids who were in chemistry class, doing a lab which dealt with chemicals that would stain objects, including hands. So the kids thought it would be funny to put the substance on the railings in a stairwell, so when kids touched it, their hands would be stained. I think the substance was purple. I can't remember very well. Unfortunately, the substance was unsafe to consume, and some of the kids in school didn't wash their hands before lunch. Ended with a great number of students rushed to the hospital to get their stomachs pumped. All the kids involved were suspended. Story 56. In my physics class, we were supposed to build mousetrap cars. This is where you use a string and a lever tied to a mousetrap, so when the mousetrap closes, it pulls the string and turns the wheels. During the races we had for grading, one guy almost blew his hand off and got burns all over his arms. This guy was a really stupid genius. He got the mousetrap running so that when it closed, it would complete a circuit and fire a rocket tied to the car. But then he decided to mess with it and not take out the battery. So it went off in his hand. You are no longer allowed to use rockets in that physics class. Story 57. Not me, but my friend decided to stick a nail through his hand in science class once. But it doesn't end there. He put it through his thumb, not too far under the skin, like you do with sewing needles when you're a kid. Being in science class, he saw the power boxes with the 2 clamps on it and decided to see what would happen. So he clipped the 2 wires to the nail through his thumb and turned it on. It exploded out of his thumb and left a smoldering hole in its place. I can imagine the school nurse loved that one. Story 58. In a period of 2 years, I was sent to my school nurse. Mind you, we were really small, so we only had one for 108th grade, 3 times. The first was when I fell off the slide and had a concision. The second, my finger got caught in a door hinge, and half of it came off. The third, I swallowed a dime. That one was in 8th grade. Story 59. Well, stupid, male, kid here. In preschool, when I was around 4, I told the teachers I had PMS. They thought that Schmidt was great. They made me call my mom and tell her while they all stood around laughing. Turns out I'd seen some commercial about some PMS relief pill and asked my mother what PMS was. She told me it was when you get headaches, your stomach hurts, and you don't feel good. Well, my head ached, my stomach hurt, and I didn't feel good. So obviously PMS. Story 60. In 5th grade, a friend of mine said his whiteout smelled like blueberries from being next to a blueberry-scented eraser. After I smell it, I passed it to another friend to smell it. That said, friend complained about a headache from sniffing whiteout, and next thing I knew, I was suspended for 2 days, and I needed to write an essay explaining why I shouldn't inhale or huff whiteout because it could lead to hard drugs. Story 61. In my college chem class, a kid was talking to a fellow individual behind him, albeit while walking, and bumped into me, spilling sodium hydroxide all over my arm. Not painful at first, but as you wiped it off your arm, it becomes slimy. That is your skin melting off. Once it hits the nerve endings, you realized you're in a world of pain. Story 62. I had a 1st grader stick a beat up his nose while at recess. The nurse's office was a small, sterile, closet-sized room. She told him to hold the other nostril and blow for all it was worth. Ping, ping, ping. That thing popped right out and bounced all over the room. He told that story all year long. Story 63. Got a ball bearing stuck in my ear. In high school. Went to the nurse. and it was deep enough that she couldn't find it. Ended up calling my mom, and she got it out in the school parking lot with a big magnet. Still got to go home for the day, so it was worth it. Story 64. Another student followed me into the metal shop's materials room, where they keep all the raw materials, and started a fight. We were at the grappling stage, and I went over forwards and hit my face on a metal corner. When he saw me bleeding, he bailed, so I went to the teacher, who looked up from his desk and freaked out. Ended up getting stitches. Never identified the other guy, who wanted to be my best friend after that. Story 65. Not a counselor or nurse, but I can honestly say I ended up in the nurse's office in the 8th grade because I had a mousetrap stuck to my head, one of the extremely sticky kind. Some kid slapped it on my head, hair as a joke, and I nearly ripped my scalp off trying to remove it. I subsequently landed in the counselor's office. Double win. Story 66. In gym class during my freshman year of high school, there were a couple of guys horse playing and running around the locker room. They ran around the back office that was near the showers, and one of the kids slipped on the water and went headfirst into the window, which proceeded to break in half and come down on his neck like a guillotine. Blood everywhere. He ended up living and having several operations and cosmetic surgeries to repair the injury. Story 67. Not school, but WTF. Mother had 17-year-old son committed involuntarily stating that he was suicidal. Stated that he had made a noose in the backyard. That he had made statements of intent. After intensive one-to-one with him, he was calm, but in WTF mode. Found out she wanted him to have a mental health record so that she could prevent him from leaving home. He was a month away from turning 18. It was her last desperate attempt to keep him from leaving her crazy ass. Story 68. A kid brought in dried cat food and convinced his friends to try it, saying it was trail mix or something. They caught on fast and were pretty upset. But it gets worse. I work at a school for Islamic students, and when the teacher looked at the label, pork was a key ingredient. Parents had to be called, etc. It was a big mess. Thankfully, it was a younger grade than I teach, and I wasn't part of it. Story 69. My 7-year kid cousin was told to be as quiet as he could during story time in class. If he was the quietest one, he would get to sit in the teacher's desk. He is kind of a crazy child. He thought it would be a good idea to be super quiet by holding his breath and not even breathing. He proceeded to pass out in front of the whole class. Story 70. It was my first day of kindergarten. We're all meeting our teacher. Out of nowhere, 2 birds come flying into the classroom at the speed of light and smash into the window right next to us. The next scene was 15 screaming children running around with 2 dead birds in spasm on the floor. I'm not a school counselor, but I should have seen one that day. Story 71. I may not be a counselor, but in middle school, I was sent to the office for viewing monkey porn. I wasn't watching it to get my jollies. I just thought it was really funny and showing it to people. But I will never forget the look on my principal's face when she saw what I was doing. Still gives me nightmares. Story 72. I remember being sent to the office for saying cheese and rice. We had a substitute who was a religious nut, and if you mentioned anything about Jesus or related subject, he would flip out and send you to the office. I guess he thought cheese and rice was close enough to Jesus Christ. Story 73. Not a nurse, but a kid in my 3rd grade class stuck his head through the square hole in the back of one of those plastic chairs that most schools have and couldn't get out. He did it in music class, and we all watched as 2 janitors came in and cut him out of the chair. Story 74. My school counselors were terrible. My friend wrote down, "I want to commit suicide," on the "I want to see a counselor" slip, and they never called him in. I wrote down, "I want to switch from AP English to regular," and they saw me the next day. Story 75. Stuck a plastic BB in my ear in 2nd grade. Mom picked me up and took me to her. They pulled it out and I went to school the next day. Everyone thought I was cool for going to the hospital. Story 76. Once, when I was in middle school, I tried to be cool and jump over a tennis ball net. I hit the concrete and almost fractured my hip in front of all of the guys in gym. Couldn't walk straight for a day or so. Story 77. When I was student teaching in a middle school, a student in another classroom was attempting to sniff super glue. Needless to say, the boy was not the brightest in the school and glued his eye shut. Yes, he had to go to the hospital. Story 78. My little sister's entire 3rd grade class and all of their parents had to have a meeting in the gym with the school administration to address the blowjobs being given on the school buses. Story 79. In my music class, we had to do a partner dance where you hold each other's hands and spin around. So 2 kids got really into it until one of them dislocated the other's arm. Story 80. A kid in my son's 6th grade class shat on the floor and promptly stuck his erect genitalia into it. He then puked and was sent home. Apparently, he was mentally ill.